The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Fort Garland, Colorado, as Lucas Harding's dark stallion crested the ridge overlooking the small frontier town. The year was 1873, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered buildings that lined the main street. Lucas adjusted his worn Stetson, his steel blue eyes narrowing at the sight below. He hadn't come to Fort Garland looking for anything but trouble and the man who'd killed his brother, but fate had other plans waiting in the dawn light. The town was just beginning to stir as Lucas rode down the main street. His tall frame sat easy in the saddle, years of riding evident in his posture. At 30 years old, Lucas had spent the last decade drifting from town to town, taking odd jobs and occasionally working as a hired gun when money got tight. The war had left him hardened, and his brother's murder had given him purpose. Now that purpose had led him to Fort Garland. Lucas dismounted outside the livery stable, his spurs jingling against the hard-packed dirt. The livery owner, a grizzled old man with a permanent squint, emerged from the shadows. 5 cents a day, feed included, the man said, eyeing Lucas's worn but well-cared-for gear. 10 cents extra if you want him groomed. Lucas nodded and handed over a quarter. That'll cover the next few days. Name's Lucas Harding. The old man pocketed the coin without comment. Sam Wilson, you passing through or staying a spell? Depends on what I find, Lucas replied, his voice giving nothing away. Sam nodded sagely. Town's got a decent hotel. Sheriff's fair but won't stand for trouble. We got a saloon that serves passable whiskey, and Miss Violet's bakery opens at dawn if you're looking for something to fill your belly that ain't beans. Lucas unstrapped his saddlebags and rifle. Might check that out. Any strangers come through town recently? Looking for a man named Frank Doyle. Sam's expression shuddered. Can't say I recall. Sheriff might know. Lucas recognized the lie but didn't press. Information would come one way or another. He nodded his thanks and headed toward the hotel. The Fort Garland Hotel was a 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint and clean windows. The proprietress, a stout woman with graying hair, gave him a room on the 2nd floor overlooking the main street. Lucas washed the trail dust from his face, cleaned his Colt revolver, and stretched out on the bed. He needed to learn the rhythms of this town, to find the man he was hunting without drawing too much attention. Sleep came in fits and starts, and Lucas rose before dawn, drawn by the smell of baking bread that wafted through his open window. His stomach growled, reminding him that his last proper meal had been 2 days ago. Pulling on his boots and buckling his gun belt, he decided to investigate the source of that tempting aroma. The streets were empty except for a few early risers as Lucas followed his nose to a small storefront with a freshly painted sign that read, Townsend's Bakery. Warm light spilled onto the boardwalk from the windows, and Lucas could see movement inside. He pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his arrival. The interior was warm and fragrant, with shelves of bread and pastries lining the walls. Behind the counter stood a woman with her back to him, sliding a tray of rolls into a massive brick oven. Be with you in just a moment, she called over her shoulder, her voice melodious and warm. Lucas removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his dusty appearance. No hurry, madam. She turned then, and Lucas felt as though the air had been knocked from his lungs. The woman was young, perhaps 25, with copper-colored hair pulled back in a practical bun, though wisps had escaped to frame her face. Her cheeks were flushed from the oven's heat, and a dusting of flour marked her apron and one cheek. But it was her eyes that caught him, a vivid green that reminded him of spring meadows, something he'd almost forgotten existed in this harsh land. "Welcome to Townsend's Bakery," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Violet Townsend. You're an early riser." Lucas found his voice. "Lucas Harding, madam, just rode in yesterday. Your bread smells like heaven itself." A smile touched her lips, transforming her face from pretty to beautiful. "That's kind of you to say, Mr. Harding. What can I get for you this morning? The sourdough just came out, and I've got cinnamon rolls that'll be ready shortly." "I'll take whatever you recommend, Miss Townsend." "Been living on trail food too long to be particular." She nodded and selected a loaf from behind the counter. "This one's still warm, and please call me Violet, everyone does." "Then I'm Lucas," he replied, watching as she wrapped the bread in paper. "Passing through, Lucas?" she asked, her eyes meeting his briefly. "Not sure yet," he answered truthfully. "Depends on what I find here." Something in his tone must have alerted her, for her expression grew more guarded. "Fort Garland is a peaceful town these days. Sheriff Patterson keeps it that way." Lucas paid for his bread and a cinnamon roll. "Good to know. I'm not looking to disturb the peace." She handed him his purchases, her fingers brushing his momentarily. "That's a relief. We've had enough trouble to last us." "Trouble?" Violet hesitated. "Nothing that concerns visitors." "Enjoy your breakfast, Mr. Harding." Lucas recognized a dismissal when he heard one. He tipped his hat and left the bakery, but not before noticing the slight tremble in her hands as she turned back to her work. The bread was indeed exceptional, the crust crackling under his teeth as he sat on a bench outside and watched the town come to life. Fort Garland was smaller than many frontier towns he'd visited, but it had the essentials. The general store was opening its doors, and he could see the saloon at the far end of the street. The sheriff's office sat squarely in the middle of town, its door already open. Lucas finished his breakfast and decided his next stop would be the sheriff. Better to establish himself as law-abiding before he started asking questions that might raise suspicions. Sheriff Patterson was a man in his 50s with a weathered face and alert eyes that evaluated Lucas the moment he stepped through the door. "Morning," the sheriff said, setting aside the newspaper he'd been reading. "New in town, arrived yesterday. Lucas Harding." He extended his hand, which the sheriff shook after a moment's hesitation. "John Patterson. What brings you to Fort Garland, Mr. Harding?" Lucas had prepared his story carefully. "Looking for work, mostly. Heard there might be ranches needing hands." The sheriff nodded. "Hendrick's place is always short-handed. Mean old cuss, but pays fair. You got experience with cattle, some." "Drove herds up from Texas a few years back. Fought in the war," Lucas nodded. "Union. 10th Cavalry." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Saw my share at Shiloh, you carrying." Lucas gestured to his holster. "Never go without in unfamiliar territory. Keep it holstered in town and we'll get along fine." The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "Fort Garland's peaceful these days, and I aim to keep it that way." "Understood," Lucas replied. "I was wondering if you might know a man named Frank Doyle. Old acquaintance, heard he might be in these parts." The sheriff's face remained impassive, but Lucas didn't miss the slight narrowing of his eyes. "Can't say I do. Lot of men pass through here. What's your interest in finding this Doyle?" "We served together," Lucas lied smoothly. "He owes me money." Sheriff Patterson studied him for a long moment. "If I hear anything, I'll let you know. In the meantime, the Hendricks Ranch is about 5 miles east of town. Mention my name might help." Lucas thanked him and left, knowing he'd gotten nothing but confirmation that the sheriff was either protecting Doyle or knew something he wasn't sharing. Either way, Lucas would need to tread carefully. The sun was climbing higher as Lucas considered his next move. He decided to take a walk around town to get his bearings and perhaps pick up some gossip. Fort Garland was laid out like many frontier towns, with a main street lined with businesses and side streets where homes had been built. The town had a permanent feel to it, with some structures made of brick rather than just wood, suggesting it had been established for some time. As Lucas passed the general store, the door opened, and Violet Townsend emerged, carrying a basket of supplies. She spotted him and nodded in greeting. "Enjoying your tour of our little town?" she asked, adjusting her basket. "It's a fine place," Lucas replied, stepping forward. "Allow me to help you with that." She hesitated, then relented, handing him the basket. "I'm just heading back to the bakery. It's not far." They walked side by side, Violet occasionally greeting townspeople they passed. "You seem well liked," Lucas observed. A small smile played at her lips. "Bread is a necessity, and good bread makes friends. I've been here 4 years now. People have gotten used to me." "You weren't born here." She shook her head. "Boston originally. Came west with my father after my mother died. He opened the bakery, taught me everything he knew. And your father," her expression clouded. "Passed 2 years ago, pneumonia." "I'm sorry," Lucas said sincerely. "Thank you." She glanced at him curiously. "What about you? Where do you call home?" "Nowhere in particular these days," he answered. "Born in Pennsylvania but left young. The war, then drifting." They reached the bakery, and Violet unlocked the side door. "Sounds lonely," she commented, leading him into a small kitchen area behind the shop. Lucas set the basket on a wooden table. "I suppose it is at times." She turned to face him, studying him with those remarkable green eyes. "You're not really looking for ranch work, are you, Mr. Harding?" The directness of her question surprised him. "What makes you say that?" "Your hands," she said simply. "They're not a rancher's hands, and there's something in your eyes. You're hunting someone." Lucas considered denying it but found himself unwilling to lie to her. "You're observant, Miss Townsend. It's a useful quality in a small town." She began unpacking her supplies. "Whoever you're looking for, I hope you find what you're after without bringing trouble to Fort Garland." "So do I," Lucas replied honestly. She glanced up at him, concern evident in her expression. "Be careful around here, Mr. Harding. Some secrets are well guarded." Before Lucas could ask what she meant, the bell at the front of the shop jingled, announcing a customer. Violet excused herself, leaving Lucas to wonder about her cryptic warning. He left the bakery with more questions than answers, and decided his next stop would be the saloon. If there was one place to gather information in a frontier town, it was where men drank. The Frontier Saloon was relatively quiet in the early afternoon, with only a few patrons scattered at tables. The bartender, a heavy-set man with an impressive mustache, nodded as Lucas approached. "Whiskey," Lucas ordered, placing a coin on the scarred wooden bar. The bartender poured the drink and pushed it toward him. "Passing through, maybe," Lucas replied, taking a sip of the amber liquid. It burned pleasantly going down. "Depends on what I find here." "Name's Hank," the bartender offered. "You looking for something in particular?" "Information, mainly. Trying to track down an old associate." Hank raised an eyebrow. "This associate got a name, Frank Doyle." The bartender's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked briefly to a man sitting alone at a corner table. "Can't help you there," he said, a bit too quickly. "But if you're sticking around, we got a card game tonight. Friendly stakes." Lucas nodded, thanking the bartender while making note of the man in the corner. He was middle-aged, well-dressed, with the look of a businessman rather than a gunslinger. Lucas took his drink and found a table where he could observe without being obvious. Over the next hour, the saloon gradually filled with more patrons. Lucas nursed his drink and listened to the conversations around him. He learned that Fort Garland had grown significantly in the past few years, that there was talk of the railroad coming through, and that the well-dressed man in the corner was Edmund Clark, the town banker. As the afternoon wore on, Lucas decided to head back to his hotel to rest before returning for the evening card game. As he stepped outside, he nearly collided with Violet, who was hurrying down the boardwalk. "Mr. Harding," she said, sounding slightly breathless, "I was looking for you." "Is something wrong?" he asked, noticing her agitated state. She glanced around nervously. "Not here. Could you walk me home? It's just behind the bakery." Intrigued and concerned, Lucas offered his arm, which she took. They walked in silence until they reached the small house connected to the back of the bakery. Once inside, Violet seemed to relax slightly, though her movements were still tense as she lit a lamp. "I'm sorry for the mysterious behavior," she said, gesturing for him to sit at a small table. "But I overheard something I think you should know." Lucas remained standing. "About Frank Doyle," Violet nodded. "You asked Sheriff Patterson about him this morning. The sheriff came into the bakery after you left, and he was talking with Edmund Clark, the banker." "What did they say?" "They mentioned your name and seemed worried. Clark said something like if he's asking about Doyle, he could unravel everything. The sheriff told him not to worry, that they would handle it like they did before." Lucas's expression darkened. "Before?" Violet hesitated, then said, "There was another man who came to town asking questions about 6 months ago. He disappeared after 2 days. Sheriff said he moved on, but—" She trailed off. "But you don't believe that," Lucas finished for her. She shook her head. "He left all his things at the hotel. Nobody just leaves without their belongings." Lucas studied her face, trying to determine her motives. "Why are you telling me this? You don't know me." Violet's eyes met his unflinchingly. "Because I've watched this town change over the past year. Good people afraid to speak up, money changing hands that can't be explained, and because—" She faltered, "because there was something honest in your eyes when you came into my bakery this morning." Lucas felt a surge of respect for her courage. "Thank you for the warning. But now you've put yourself at risk." "I've been careful," she assured him. "No one saw me come to find you." Lucas wasn't convinced. "Even so, you should be cautious. If what you're suggesting is true, these men won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens them." Violet squared her shoulders. "I can take care of myself, Mr. Harding. I just thought you should know what you're up against." He nodded, appreciating her spirit. "Call me Lucas, please. And I don't suppose you know where I might find this Frank Doyle." She shook her head. "I've never met anyone by that name. But if he's connected to Sheriff Patterson and Edmund Clark, he might be part of whatever they're involved in." "And what do you think that is?" Lucas asked. "I don't know for certain," Violet admitted. "But ever since the silver mine reopened outside of town last year, things have been different. There are new men in town who don't seem to do any actual mining. They spend freely at the saloon and keep to themselves." Lucas processed this information. The mine could be a front for something else. Wouldn't be the first time. Whatever it is, it's changed Fort Garland. And not for the better. Violet moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "You should go. It's getting dark and people might wonder if they see you leaving my home." Lucas picked up his hat. "Thank you for the risk you took. I won't forget it." As he reached the door, Violet called softly, "Lucas, be careful tonight." He turned back to her, struck again by her beauty in the lamplight. "I always am." The evening brought a cooler breeze as Lucas made his way back to the saloon. The place was now crowded, filled with smoke and the sounds of men unwinding after a day's work. The card game had already started at a large table in the back, and Lucas noted that Edmund Clark was among the players. Lucas ordered another whiskey and approached the table. "Room for one more?" he asked casually. Clark looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized Lucas from earlier. "5-card draw, 20-cent ante. You in?" "Sounds fair," Lucas replied, pulling out a chair. As the game progressed, Lucas played conservatively, winning small pots and losing others, all while observing his fellow players. Besides Clark, there were 3 other men: a cattle driver named Pete, a store clerk called Timothy, and a well-dressed stranger introduced only as Johnson. The conversation flowed with the whiskey, and Lucas carefully steered it toward the town's prosperity. "Fort Garland seems to be doing well," he commented, arranging his cards. "Better than most places I've passed through recently." Clark nodded, his expression smug. "We've had some good fortune. The silver mine reopening has brought new life to the area." "Heard about that," Lucas said. "Always looking for investment opportunities." "Mine doing well, exceptionally," Clark replied. "Those shares are hard to come by these days. The original investors are quite satisfied with the returns." Johnson, who had remained mostly silent, spoke up. "You said you were new in town, Mr. Harding. What brings you to Fort Garland specifically?" Lucas felt the shift in atmosphere. "Just passing through looking for work, though I'm also trying to track down an old Army buddy, Frank Doyle. Heard he might be in these parts." The table grew quiet. Clark and Johnson exchanged glances. "Don't know any Doyle," Johnson said flatly. "Perhaps you were misinformed." Lucas shrugged. "Perhaps, or perhaps he's using another name these days. He always was a slippery character." Clark's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, Fort Garland is a small town. If he were here, someone would know him." The game continued, but the mood had changed. Lucas noticed Johnson slip away briefly and return looking satisfied. When Lucas cashed out an hour later, having lost a modest sum, he felt eyes following him as he left the saloon. Outside, the night air cleared his head. Lucas took a circuitous route back to the hotel, making sure he wasn't being followed. His room was as he'd left it, but he slept with his gun close at hand. Morning came with the now familiar smell of baking bread. Lucas rose early, his mind turning over the information he'd gathered. Frank Doyle was connected to Clark and the sheriff, and something illegal was happening involving the silver mine. But Lucas needed proof before he could act. He decided his next move would be to investigate the mine itself. But first, he wanted to speak with Violet again. The bakery was already busy when Lucas arrived. Violet was serving a line of customers, her movements efficient and her smile genuine. She didn't seem surprised to see him but gave no indication that they had spoken privately the previous day. When the rush subsided, Lucas approached the counter. "Good morning, Miss Townsend. Those cinnamon rolls smell even better today." "Fresh out of the oven, Mr. Harding," she replied, selecting one for him. "Will you be staying in Fort Garland long? A few more days at least. I thought I might take a ride out to see the countryside." "I hear the silver mine is worth a look." A flicker of concern crossed her face. "It's private property, heavily guarded, not much to see unless you have business there." "Is that so? Perhaps I'll just enjoy the mountain views then." Violet wrapped his purchase carefully. "The mountains to the west offer the best vistas. The trail can be a bit treacherous, though. Easy to get lost if you don't know the way." Lucas understood her message. "Perhaps I could find a guide." "My day off is tomorrow," she said casually. "I often ride out that way myself, for the fresh air." "What time would you recommend starting such a journey?" Lucas asked, playing along with the charade for any listening ears. "Dawn is best. The light on the mountains is beautiful then." Lucas paid for his roll. "I'll keep that in mind. Thank you, Miss Townsend." He left the bakery with a plan forming. Violet knew something about the mine, or at least knew how to get there undetected. Lucas would meet her at dawn and discover what secrets Fort Garland was hiding. The rest of the day passed slowly. Lucas made a show of inquiring about ranch work at the general store, where the proprietor confirmed that the Hendricks Ranch was indeed hiring. He purchased supplies for a day's ride, including ammunition for his rifle, drawing curious looks from the storekeeper. "Planning a hunting trip?" the man asked as he tallied Lucas's purchases. "Just being prepared," Lucas replied. "Never know what you might encounter in the wilderness." As evening approached, Lucas noticed increased activity around the sheriff's office. Patterson and two deputies were loading rifles into saddle holsters, their expressions grim. Lucas lingered across the street, pretending to examine goods in a shop window while listening. "Clark wants this handled tonight," Patterson was saying. "No more delays." One of the deputies, a young man barely out of his teens, looked nervous. "What if they resist again? Then they'll meet the same end as the others," the sheriff replied coldly. "The shipment needs to go out tomorrow. We can't afford another problem." The men mounted their horses and rode out of town, heading east. Lucas considered following them but decided against it. Whatever they were planning, it would be better to learn more before confronting them directly, and he had an appointment with Violet at dawn. Lucas returned to the hotel, cleaned his weapons, and tried to rest, though sleep eluded him. His thoughts kept returning to Violet Townsend, her courage in warning him, and the flash of her green eyes when she smiled. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself to think of a woman as anything other than a passing acquaintance. The life he'd chosen didn't allow for attachments, but there was something about Violet that stirred feelings he'd thought long buried. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Lucas slipped out of the hotel. The town was silent, most residents still asleep. He made his way to the bakery, surprised to find it dark. Usually, Violet would already be working at this hour. He approached cautiously, listening for any sound from within. The door was locked, the windows dark. Concern growing, Lucas moved around to the back of the building where her small house stood. A light flickered behind the curtains, and he knocked softly. The door opened immediately, revealing Violet dressed in riding clothes, a split skirt and sturdy jacket. Her hair was braided and tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. "You're here," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I said I would," Lucas replied. "Is everything all right? Your bakery's dark." "I left a note saying I was ill," she explained, gathering a small pack. "It's the first day I've closed in 4 years. People will gossip, but it can't be helped." "Violet," Lucas said seriously, "if this is too dangerous, it's already dangerous," she interrupted. "I heard what happened at the saloon last night. Johnson works for Edmund Clark, he's his enforcer. If they suspect you're asking questions about the mine, you're already in trouble." Lucas didn't bother asking how she knew about the card game. Small towns had their own way of spreading information. All the more reason for you to stay out of it. She straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I've stayed out of it for too long. My father wouldn't have remained silent, and neither will I. Now, we need to go. I have horses waiting at my friend's stable." Lucas recognized the determination in her eyes and nodded. "Lead the way." They moved through the pre-dawn shadows to a small stable 2 streets over. A sleepy-looking teenage boy was waiting with 2 saddled horses. "Thanks, Tommy," Violet said, pressing a coin into his hand. "Remember, I ain't seen nothing and I ain't heard nothing," the boy recited. "Be careful, Miss Violet." They mounted up and rode out of town to the west, keeping to back trails until they were well away from Fort Garland. As they climbed into the foothills, the first rays of sunlight painted the mountains gold and pink. "It's beautiful country," Lucas commented, riding beside Violet. "It is," she agreed. "That's part of why I stayed after my father died. I fell in love with these mountains, the open spaces. And the town," a shadow crossed her face. "The town was good once. Simple, hard-working people trying to build something lasting. Then last year, everything changed." "When the mine reopened," Violet nodded. The original silver mine played out 10 years ago. Then suddenly, Edmund Clark announced he'd found investors to reopen it. New equipment was brought in, miners hired from outside the area, but local men who applied for work were turned away. Suspicious, Lucas agreed. Very. And then the shipments started. Heavily guarded wagons leaving the mine at odd hours, always with Sheriff Patterson or his deputies escorting them. They rode in silence for a while, following a narrow trail that wound through pine forests and across small streams. Violet clearly knew the way well, navigating without hesitation. "How much further?" Lucas asked as they paused to rest the horses. "Another hour," Violet replied. "We need to approach from the north. The main entrance is too well guarded, but I discovered a vantage point where we can observe without being seen." Lucas studied her with new appreciation. "You've been investigating on your own." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "My father taught me more than baking. He was a journalist in Boston before moving west. He believed in seeking the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. A dangerous philosophy out here, perhaps, but necessary." She remounted her horse. "We should keep moving." The trail grew steeper, and they dismounted to lead the horses the final stretch. Finally, Violet signaled for them to secure the animals, and they continued on foot until they reached a rocky outcropping overlooking a valley. Below them, the silver mine sprawled across the landscape. Lucas could see the main shaft entrance, surrounded by buildings and equipment. Men moved about the compound, and armed guards patrolled the perimeter. What caught his attention, however, was the activity centered around a large warehouse some distance from the main shaft. "That's unusual," he murmured, pointing. "Mining operations don't typically need that much storage." Violet handed him a small spyglass. "Look closer." Through the glass, Lucas could see men loading crates onto wagons. The crates were small but appeared heavy from the way the men struggled with them. "Silver ore wouldn't be packed like that," Lucas said, "and it wouldn't be shipped out in small batches. They'd smelt it first." "Exactly," Violet replied. "Whatever they're mining, it isn't silver. Or at least not just silver." Lucas continued observing, noting the armed men positioned around the warehouse. "Weapons," he said suddenly. "Those crates are the right size for rifles." Violet nodded grimly. "That's what I suspected, gun running. But to whom? I don't know. But whoever they're selling to, it can't be legal." She pointed to another area of the compound. "There's something else. See that smaller building to the east? Men go in, but I've never seen anyone come out." Lucas trained the spyglass on the indicated building. It was nondescript, with no windows and a single door guarded by 2 armed men. "Could be storage," he suggested, though he didn't believe it himself. "Or prisoners," Violet said softly. "Lucas, the man who came asking questions 6 months ago, he disappeared right after visiting the mine." Lucas lowered the spyglass, his expression hardening. "We need to get closer." Violet looked alarmed. "That's too dangerous. The guards shoot trespassers on sight." "I need to know if Frank Doyle is down there," Lucas insisted. "I need to see for myself what they're doing." "Why is finding this man so important to you?" Violet asked. Lucas was silent for a long moment. "Frank Doyle murdered my brother. Shot him in the back over a card game in Pueblo. I've been tracking him for 3 months." Understanding dawned in Violet's eyes. "You came for revenge." "I came for justice," Lucas corrected. "The law in Pueblo couldn't or wouldn't touch him. He had friends in high places." "Like he seems to have here," Violet observed. Lucas nodded, his jaw tight. "If he's part of this operation, it explains a lot. Doyle always had connections to arms dealers. He wasn't just a killer, he was a businessman." Violet placed a hand on his arm. "Even if that's true, you can't just walk in there. They'll kill you before you get 10 feet inside the compound." Lucas knew she was right, but frustration gnawed at him. So close to finding Doyle, yet still out of reach. There has to be a way. There might be, Violet said hesitantly, but it would mean waiting until nightfall. Lucas raised an eyebrow questioningly. The guards change shifts at midnight, she explained. There's a brief window when the perimeter is less secured, and I know a drainage tunnel that runs under the eastern fence. How do you know all this? Lucas asked, impressed and slightly concerned. Violet's expression was determined. I told you I've been watching. My father taught me to be thorough. Lucas considered their options. Sneaking into a heavily guarded compound was dangerous, but if it meant confirming Doyle's presence and gathering evidence of illegal activities, it might be worth the risk. We'll need to be careful, he said finally. If they catch us. They won't, Violet assured him, though her confidence seemed forced. We'll just observe, gather information, and leave. No confrontations. Lucas wasn't sure he could make that promise, but he nodded agreement. We'll need supplies. Food, water, matches. I brought provisions, Violet said, patting her pack. Enough for the day. We can find shelter in the old hunter's cabin about a mile from here and wait for nightfall. They retreated from their observation point and collected the horses. Violet led them through the forest to a small, abandoned cabin nestled among tall pines. The structure was weathered but intact, offering protection from the elements and prying eyes. Inside, Lucas checked the perimeter while Violet organized their supplies. The cabin consisted of a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot. Lucas gathered wood while Violet prepared a cold meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat. As they ate, Lucas found himself studying Violet's profile. In the filtered sunlight, her copper hair took on a golden hue and her movements were graceful despite the rustic surroundings. She caught him watching and smiled shyly. "What?" she asked. "You surprise me," Lucas admitted. "Most women would run from danger, not toward it." Violet's smile faded. Most women haven't watched their community slowly corrupted while feeling helpless to stop it. After my father died, I felt adrift. The bakery kept me busy, but I knew he would have wanted me to do more. He would be proud, Lucas said softly. She looked away, blinking rapidly. "I hope so." After a moment, she continued, "What about your family? Besides your brother, I mean. Parents died when I was young. My brother raised me." Lucas rarely spoke of his past, but something about Violet made him want to share. "After the war, we drifted together for a while, then settled in Pueblo. Matthew was the steady one, had plans to start a ranch, maybe a family. And then Doyle killed him," Violet finished quietly. Lucas nodded, his throat tight. "Over nothing. A dispute about a hand of cards. Matt wasn't even armed." Violet reached across the table and took his hand. Her touch was warm, comforting. "I'm sorry, Lucas." They sat in silence, hands joined as sunlight shifted across the cabin floor. Lucas felt a connection forming between them, something unexpected and powerful. It both alarmed and attracted him. Finally, Violet withdrew her hand and stood. "We should rest if we're going to be alert tonight." They took turns sleeping on the cot, with the other keeping watch. Lucas found it difficult to rest, his mind cycling through possible scenarios for the night ahead. When it was his turn to keep watch, he spent the time cleaning his revolver and checking his ammunition. The waiting was always the hardest part. As evening approached, they prepared for their mission. Lucas strapped on his gun belt and tucked a hunting knife into his boot. Violet changed into darker clothing and braided her hair tightly against her head. "You don't have to do this," Lucas told her as they readied to leave. "You could wait here. I'll come back for you." Violet shook her head firmly. "I know the way in, and 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1. They left the cabin as twilight deepened, moving cautiously through the forest toward the mine. The horses were left hobbled near a stream, where they would have water and grass until their return. Night had fully fallen by the time they reached the drainage tunnel Violet had mentioned. It was narrow but passable, running beneath the perimeter fence and emptying into a gully near the mysterious building they had observed earlier. "The guards pass by every 15 minutes, Violet whispered as they crouched in the shadows. "We need to time this perfectly." Lucas nodded, watching the patrol pattern. When the guards moved to the far side of the compound, he signaled, and they darted across the open space to the shadow of the small building. Pressing against the wall, they listened intently. From inside came the sound of men's voices, low and desperate. "Water, please. Just a little water. Shut up in there. You'll get your ration in the morning." Lucas and Violet exchanged grim looks. Prisoners, just as she had suspected. They moved cautiously around the building until they found a small ventilation window near the roof. Lucas boosted Violet up so she could peer inside. "There are at least 6 men," she whispered when he lowered her down. "Chained to the walls. They look like miners. Forced labor," Lucas surmised. "Probably working in areas of the mine too dangerous for willing men." A sudden commotion from the main compound drew their attention. Men were gathering around the warehouse, and wagons were being prepared. Lucas recognized Sheriff Patterson directing activities, his voice carrying in the night air. "Get those crates loaded. We need to be on the road before dawn." Keeping to the shadows, Lucas and Violet worked their way closer to the warehouse. Through an open door, they could see men loading wooden crates stamped with military markings. "Army rifles," Lucas muttered. "They're stealing from military shipments. Or intercepting them," Violet suggested. The railroad spur that passes near Fort Garland sometimes carries military supplies to the western forts. As they watched, a well-dressed man emerged from the warehouse office. Even in the dim light, Lucas recognized Edmund Clark. And beside him, gesturing emphatically, was a face Lucas had searched for across 3 states. "Doyle," he growled, his hand automatically moving to his revolver. Frank Doyle stood in a pool of lamplight, directing workers with the arrogance of a man used to being obeyed. He was thinner than Lucas remembered, his once handsome face hardened by time and his own choices. But it was unmistakably the man who had murdered Matthew Harding. Lucas started forward, only to be restrained by Violet's hand on his arm. "Not yet," she whispered urgently. "We need to get out of here with what we know. We can bring help." Lucas hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to confront his brother's killer. But Violet was right. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Better to retreat and return with a plan. They began to back away, staying in the shadows. But as they neared the drainage tunnel, a guard appeared unexpectedly around the corner of a building. Before they could react, the man spotted them and raised his rifle. "Intruders, over here." Lucas pushed Violet toward the tunnel. "Run, I'll hold them off." Drawing his revolver, he fired at the guard, the shot going wide but forcing the man to take cover. Shouts erupted across the compound as Lucas backed toward the tunnel, firing twice more to keep heads down. He had almost reached the tunnel entrance when a shot rang out, and searing pain tore through his left arm. Lucas stumbled but kept moving, diving into the tunnel as bullets struck the ground around him. Violet was waiting just inside, her face pale in the darkness. "You're hit." "It's just a graze," Lucas lied, though he could feel blood soaking his sleeve. "Keep moving." They crawled through the drainage tunnel as voices and footsteps pounded above them. Emerging on the far side, they ran for the cover of the forest, the sound of pursuit close behind. "We need to split up," Lucas gasped as they reached the trees. "I'll draw them off. You circle back to the horses." "No," Violet protested. "You're wounded. We stay together." Lucas was about to argue when a bullet splintered bark near his head. Making a split-second decision, he grabbed Violet's hand, and they plunged deeper into the forest. They ran through the darkness, guided only by starlight filtering through the trees. Lucas could feel his strength ebbing as blood loss took its toll, but he forced himself to keep moving. Behind them, shouts and occasional gunfire indicated their pursuers hadn't given up. After what seemed like hours, they reached a small stream. Lucas paused, listening intently. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but he knew it was temporary. Once daylight came, the search would intensify. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. Violet shook her head firmly. "Not until I look at that arm. You're leaving a blood trail." She led him to a sheltered spot beneath overhanging rocks and helped him remove his jacket. The bullet had torn through the muscle of his upper arm, missing the bone but leaving a deep, bloody furrow. Using water from the stream and strips torn from her petticoat, Violet cleaned and bandaged the wound as best she could. Her touch was gentle but efficient, her face set in concentration. "You've done this before," Lucas observed. A sad smile touched her lips. "My father was clumsy in his workshop, and during the war our home in Boston was used as an auxiliary hospital for a time." When she had finished, Lucas flexed his arm experimentally. The pain was intense but manageable. "Thank you." Violet looked up at him, her face close to his in the darkness. "We need to get you to a doctor." "Not in Fort Garland," Lucas said. "If Doyle and Patterson know we were at the mine, the town isn't safe for either of us." "There's a settlement about 15 miles west," Violet suggested. "If we can reach our horses, we could be there by morning." Lucas nodded, though the prospect of more travel made his wounded arm throb. "We should move. The stream will help hide our trail for a while." They waded downstream for nearly a mile before cutting back toward the hunter's cabin where they had left their horses. The night was growing colder, and Lucas could see Violet shivering in her damp clothing. "Here," he said, draping his relatively dry jacket over her shoulders despite her protests. They reached the cabin as false dawn lightened the eastern sky. To their relief, the horses were still there, though nervous and skittish. "Someone's been here," Violet whispered, pointing to fresh boot prints in the soft earth around the cabin. Lucas drew his revolver. "Stay behind me." They approached cautiously, but the cabin appeared empty. Inside, however, their remaining supplies had been scattered and a message had been carved into the wooden table. "Dead by sundown." Violet paled but maintained her composure. "We need to go. Now." They mounted quickly, Lucas gritting his teeth against the pain as he pulled himself into the saddle. As the sun rose, they rode west, staying off main trails and keeping to the cover of forests where possible. By mid-morning, Lucas was feverish, the wound in his arm hot and throbbing. Violet insisted they stop to rest, leading them to a secluded clearing beside a small pond. "You need medicine," she said, helping him dismount. The wound could be festering. Lucas didn't argue. He knew the signs of infection, and realized he wouldn't be much use to either of them if the fever worsened. He sank down against a tree trunk, closing his eyes briefly against a wave of dizziness. Violet searched through her scattered supplies, finding a small tin of salve. "This might help," she said, kneeling beside him. "It's for burns, but it has herbs to fight infection." As she unwrapped the bloody bandage and applied the salve, Lucas watched her face. Despite the danger, despite being hunted, she showed no sign of panic or regret. "You're remarkable," he murmured. Violet glanced up, a flush coloring her cheeks. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." "No," Lucas insisted. "You're brave, braver than most men I've known." She finished rewrapping his arm, her fingers lingering on his skin. "We should reach the settlement by nightfall. There's a doctor there who won't ask questions." Lucas caught her hand. "Violet, when this is over." She met his gaze, her green eyes steady. "Let's survive first, then we can talk about after." They rested for an hour, then continued westward. The terrain grew more rugged, with steep ravines and dense pine forests. Lucas fought to stay alert, but the fever made his thoughts wander. Several times, Violet had to call him back to attention when he began to slump in the saddle. Late in the afternoon, they paused on a ridge overlooking the valley below. In the distance, they could see the cluster of buildings that marked the settlement Violet had mentioned. It was still several miles away, across open terrain. "We'll be exposed," Lucas noted, surveying the landscape. "No cover for the last stretch," Violet nodded grimly. "But we don't have much choice. You need a doctor, and we need help if we're going to stop what's happening at the mine." As they prepared to descend the ridge, the sound of approaching horses froze them in place. Lucas drew his revolver despite his shaking hand, but Violet placed a calming hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Look." A small group of riders appeared on the trail below, moving slowly up the ridge. They were not the rough men from the mine, but appeared to be travelers, a man, woman, and 2 teenagers, accompanied by a loaded pack mule. "They might help us," Violet suggested, "or at least provide cover until we reach the settlement." Lucas hesitated, unwilling to involve innocent people in their trouble, but his condition was worsening and they had few options. Finally, he nodded. They rode down to intercept the family, who regarded them warily as they approached. "Afternoon," the man called, his hand resting near his rifle. "You folks lost?" "Not lost," Violet replied, adopting a friendly tone. "My husband is injured and we're trying to reach Clearwater to find a doctor." The man relaxed slightly at her non-threatening demeanor. "That's where we're headed ourselves, visiting my wife's sister." He studied Lucas's pale face and blood-stained bandage. "What happened to him?" "Mining accident," Violet lied smoothly. "He works at the Silver Ridge operation near Fort Garland." The man nodded sympathetically. "Dangerous work. We can travel together if you'd like. Safety in numbers out here." "We'd appreciate that," Violet said with genuine relief. The family introduced themselves as the Williamses, Joseph and Martha, with their children Sarah and Thomas. They were homesteaders from the Eastern Valley, making a rare trip to town for supplies and family visiting. As they traveled together, Lucas fought to stay conscious. The fever made the landscape shimmer and shift before his eyes, and conversations reached him as if from a great distance. Violet rode close beside him, occasionally steadying him when he swayed. The sun was setting when they finally reached the outskirts of Clearwater. The settlement was smaller than Fort Garland but appeared well established, with a main street lined with businesses and homes spreading outward. Joseph Williams directed them to a small house near the church. "Doc Miller lives there. Good man. Keeps to himself." Violet thanked him profusely, and they parted ways, the Williams family continuing to their relative's home with promises to check on them the next day. Dr. Miller was an elderly man with kind eyes and steady hands. He asked no questions as he examined Lucas's wound, cleaning it thoroughly and applying a poultice before stitching it closed. "Bullet wound," he commented matter-of-factly. "Not my first, won't be my last. The fever should break by morning if infection doesn't set in." He provided them with a small room behind his surgery, refusing payment when Violet offered what little money they had left. "Rest now," he advised. "Whatever trouble you're in, it can wait until he's stronger." Left alone, Violet sat beside the narrow bed where Lucas lay, his face flushed with fever but his breathing steady. She bathed his forehead with cool water, worry evident in her features. In his fever-induced haze, Lucas caught glimpses of her face, sometimes replacing it with memories of his brother. past and present blurred as the night wore on, but always, Violet's gentle touch anchored him to reality. Sometime in the night, he surfaced from delirious dreams to find her still beside him, her head resting on the edge of the bed, her hand holding his. Even in sleep, her face showed concern, and Lucas felt a surge of emotion so powerful it momentarily cleared his fevered mind. He had come to Fort Garland seeking vengeance, focused solely on finding Frank Doyle. Instead, he had found Violet Townsend, a woman whose courage and compassion had awakened feelings he thought long dead. Whatever happened next, Lucas knew his life had changed irrevocably. As dawn approached, Lucas's fever broke, leaving him weak but clear-headed. Violet awoke as he stirred, relief washing over her face when she saw his improved condition. "You're better," she said, touching his forehead to confirm the fever had passed. Lucas managed a smile. "Thanks to you." She shook her head. "Dr. Miller did the real work, I just worried. You did more than that. You saved my life out there." He reached for her hand. "Violet, I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, a commotion outside drew their attention. Voices raised in alarm, followed by the sound of running feet. Violet moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtain. "Riders coming into town," she reported. "At least a dozen men armed." Lucas struggled to sit up. "Doyle, he's tracked us here." Violet helped him to his feet, concern evident in her movements. "You're not strong enough to travel." "We don't have a choice," Lucas replied grimly. "If they find us, they'll kill us and anyone who helped us." Dr. Miller entered the room, his expression grave. "Your friends have arrived," he said without preamble. "Sheriff Patterson and a posse claiming to be searching for fugitives who robbed the Fort Garland bank." Lucas and Violet exchanged shocked glances. "That's a lie," Violet protested. "We were nowhere near the bank." The doctor nodded. "I suspected as much. The sheriff's reputation has reached even Clearwater." He moved to a cabinet and withdrew a small revolver, which he handed to Violet. "There's a back way out through my root cellar. It leads to the creek bed. Follow it north, and you'll find a trail that leads to my brother's hunting cabin. You'll be safe there while you decide your next move." "Why are you helping us?" Lucas asked. The old doctor's eyes hardened. "I served with the Union Army Medical Corps. Saw too many good men die because corrupt officials supplied defective weapons. If what I suspect about Patterson and his friends is true, I won't stand by and let it continue." He gestured to Lucas's arm. "Besides, that's a bullet wound, not a mining accident." "I'm guessing whoever shot you deserved it." "We didn't rob any bank," Violet insisted. "We discovered an illegal weapons operation at the silver mine. They're using it as a cover to steal and sell Army rifles." "I believe you," Dr. Miller said. "Now go before they start searching houses." "I'll delay them as long as I can." Lucas gripped the doctor's hand. "We'll come back with proof and proper authorities." "See that you do," the doctor replied. "Good luck to you both." They gathered what supplies they could and followed the doctor's directions to the root cellar. The escape route was narrow and damp, but it brought them safely to the creek bed outside of town. Lucas was still weak, moving more slowly than he would have liked, but the urgency of their situation pushed him forward. For hours, they followed the creek northward, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest. By midday, they had reached the hunting cabin Dr. Miller had mentioned. It was well hidden among towering pines, with a clear view of the approach trail. Inside, the cabin was basic but well maintained, with a stone fireplace, simple furnishings, and shelves stocked with preserved food and medical supplies. "Your doctor friend plans ahead," Lucas commented as they inventoried their resources. Violet nodded, lighting a fire in the fireplace to combat the mountain chill. "What do we do now?" We can't go back to Fort Garland, and Doyle's men are searching for us. Lucas sat heavily on a rough-hewn chair, his wounded arm throbbing. We need help. Someone with authority beyond Patterson's reach. The territorial governor, Violet suggested. Too far, and we don't know who we can trust. Lucas thought for a moment. The army. If Doyle is stealing and selling military weapons, they'll have a direct interest in stopping him. Violet considered this. There's a cavalry outpost about 30 miles north of here. I've heard the commander is a strict-by-the-book officer. Captain James Caldwell, Lucas confirmed. I've heard of him too, honest man from all accounts. He sighed, rubbing his temples. But getting there won't be easy. Patterson will have men watching all the main trails. Then we don't use the trails, Violet said decisively. I grew up traveling these mountains with my father. There are ways through the high country that few people know. Lucas studied her face, admiring her determination even as he worried about the dangers ahead. It's risky. The weather can change quickly up there. More risky than facing Doyle's men, she countered. Besides, I know what I'm doing. Do you trust me? The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond their immediate situation. Lucas realized he did trust her more completely than he had trusted anyone since his brother's death. Yes, he said simply. I trust you. They spent the remainder of the day resting and preparing for their journey. Lucas cleaned and checked his weapons while Violet packed supplies and studied an old map she had found in the cabin. By evening, his strength was returning, though the wound still limited the use of his left arm. As night fell, they sat before the fire, sharing a simple meal of beans and dried venison. The flickering flames cast shadows across Violet's face, highlighting the copper in her hair and the determination in her eyes. Tell me about your life before Fort Garland, Lucas said, breaking the comfortable silence. What was it like growing up in Boston? A smile touched Violet's lips. Different, crowded, noisy, full of people and ideas. My father worked for a newspaper, so our home was always filled with discussions about politics and art and literature. Her expression grew wistful. My mother taught music, piano, and voice. She died when I was 16. Consumption. I'm sorry, Lucas said softly. Violet nodded acknowledgement. After she passed, my father couldn't bear to stay in Boston. Too many memories. He had always romanticized the West from the stories he wrote about it, so we came out here. She laughed softly. Reality was quite different from his articles. How so? Harsher, more primitive. But also more honest in a way. In Boston, people hide behind manners and social conventions. Out here, you know where you stand with folks. She looked directly at him. Like you don't pretend to be something you're not. Lucas shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. I'm not sure that's a compliment. I came to Fort Garland hunting a man, intent on killing him. For justice, not revenge, Violet reminded him. There's a difference. Is there? Lucas questioned. Sometimes I'm not so sure. The line seems to blur. Violet was quiet for a moment. What will you do if we succeed? If Doyle is arrested and faces legal justice? It was a question Lucas had avoided asking himself. For so long, his purpose had been clear. Find Frank Doyle and make him pay for Matthew's death. The possibility of legal proceedings had never factored into his plans. I don't know, he admitted finally. I haven't thought beyond finding him. Perhaps it's time you did, Violet suggested gently. There could be a life waiting for you after this is over. The way she said it, the look in her eyes, made Lucas's heart beat faster. What kind of life did you imagine for yourself, Violet? Before all this happened, she gazed into the fire, considering. I enjoyed the bakery, the rhythm of it, creating something people need and appreciate, but I always felt there should be more. My father raised me to believe in making a difference, however small. And now, her eyes met his. Now I know there can be more. that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's frightening." She hesitated, then added softly, "And that connections can form in the most unexpected circumstances." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. Lucas found himself moving closer to her, drawn by something more powerful than conscious thought. "Violet," he began, his voice rough with emotion. Before he could continue, a sound outside the cabin froze them both. The unmistakable snap of a twig breaking under a boot. Lucas motioned for silence, drawing his revolver. Violet extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, except for the dim glow from the fire. They moved to opposite sides of the single window, peering cautiously into the night. For several long minutes they heard nothing. Then a low whistle, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. "Scouts," Lucas whispered. "They haven't found us yet, but they're searching the area." "We need to leave," Violet said, already gathering their packs. "Now, while it's dark." They slipped out the back of the cabin, moving silently into the forest. The night was clear, stars providing just enough light to navigate by. Violet led the way, her knowledge of the terrain guiding them steadily upward into the mountains. By dawn, they had climbed high enough to look back over the valley. Far below, they could see riders moving along the trails, the search continuing. But their path had taken them well away from the hunting patterns of Patterson's men. The day was spent traversing increasingly rugged terrain. Narrow game trails led them through dense forests and across rocky slopes. The altitude made breathing difficult, especially for Lucas in his weakened state, but he pressed on without complaint. Late in the afternoon, they reached a high pass that offered a panoramic view of the land beyond. In the far distance, they could make out what appeared to be buildings the cavalry outpost, still at least a day's journey away. "We'll camp here tonight," Violet decided, noticing Lucas's pallor. "There's shelter in those rocks, and we'll have warning if anyone approaches." They made a cold camp, unwilling to risk a fire that might be spotted from below. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. They huddled together for warmth, wrapped in the single blanket they had brought from the cabin. "Tell me about your brother," Violet said softly as they watched the stars emerge above them. "What was he like?" Lucas smiled at the memory. "Matthew was the best man I ever knew, patient, kind, but strong when he needed to be. He practically raised me after our parents died. Worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table." His voice grew rough with emotion. "He was the one who insisted I go to school, learn to read and write properly. Said one day I'd need more than muscle to make my way." "He sounds wonderful," Violet said, her hand finding his in the darkness. "He was. After the war, he was the one who kept me going. I came back, changed, angry, but Matt knew how to handle me, got me working, kept me out of trouble." Lucas sighed heavily. "He was going to marry a girl in Pueblo, had it all planned out, the ranch, the house he would build her. Then Doyle killed him over a handful of cards." Violet squeezed his hand. "I wish I could have known him." "He would have liked you," Lucas said with certainty. "He always said I needed someone who wouldn't put up with my nonsense." A small laugh escaped her. "Is that what I do?" "Among other things," Lucas replied, turning to look at her. Even in the darkness he could make out the fine lines of her face, the curve of her lips. Without conscious thought he leaned closer, his hand moving to cup her cheek. Violet's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that started gently but quickly deepened with shared need and emotion. When they finally parted, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't come to Fort Garland looking for this," he whispered. "Neither did I," Violet replied. "But I'm glad I found it." They held each other through the night, sharing warmth and silent promises. Dawn found them still entwined, reluctant to break the connection that had formed between them. But the day's journey awaited, and the cavalry outpost was still hours away. They ate a hasty breakfast of dried fruit and jerky before continuing their trek. The terrain gradually became less severe as they descended from the high country. By midday, they had reached more traveled paths, which brought both ease of movement and increased danger of detection. "We should avoid the main trail to the outpost," Lucas suggested as they paused to rest. "Doyle might have men watching it." Violet agreed. "There's another approach through the eastern ravine. It's longer but less visible." They were about to continue when the sound of horses approaching sent them diving for cover among dense underbrush. From their hiding place, they watched as a patrol of cavalry soldiers passed by, heading toward the outpost. "That's our chance," Lucas whispered once the soldiers had moved out of earshot. "If we can catch up to them, we'll have protection for the last stretch." They hurried after the patrol, staying just close enough to keep them in sight without revealing their presence. As the afternoon waned, the outpost came into view, a sturdy stockade with the American flag flying above it. Just as they were about to emerge from cover and make contact with the patrol, shots rang out from the forest to their right. The cavalry soldiers immediately took defensive positions, returning fire into the trees. "Ambush," Lucas realized with horror. Doyle's men must have been watching the trails after all. The firefight intensified, with the patrol outnumbered by unseen assailants. 2 soldiers fell wounded before the rest managed to retreat to a defensible position behind a rocky outcropping. "We have to help them," Violet said urgently. Lucas nodded, checking his revolver. "Stay here, I'll try to flank the attackers." "No," Violet insisted, drawing the small revolver Dr. Miller had given her. "We go together. I can shoot, my father taught me." Knowing there was no time to argue, Lucas quickly outlined a plan. They would circle around to come up behind Doyle's men, using the element of surprise to even the odds. Moving carefully through the forest, they positioned themselves behind the ambushers, 6 men concentrated on attacking the trapped soldiers. Lucas recognized one of them as Johnson, Clark's enforcer from Fort Garland. Lucas signaled to Violet, and they opened fire simultaneously. Their unexpected attack threw the ambushers into confusion. 2 went down immediately, while the others scrambled for new cover, now caught between 2 sources of gunfire. The cavalry soldiers, realizing they had unexpected allies, pressed their advantage. Within minutes, the remaining attackers were either dead or had fled into the forest. Johnson was among those who escaped, disappearing into the thick underbrush. As the gunfire ceased, Lucas and Violet emerged cautiously from their position. The sergeant in charge of the patrol eyed them suspiciously, his rifle still raised. "Identify yourselves," he commanded. Lucas holstered his weapon and raised his hands. "Lucas Harding and Violet Townsend. We need to speak with Captain Caldwell immediately. We have information about an illegal weapons operation." The sergeant hesitated, then lowered his rifle slightly. "The men who ambushed us, they're connected to this weapons operation." "Yes," Violet confirmed. "They're trying to stop us from reaching the captain." After a moment's consideration, the sergeant nodded. "2 of my men are wounded. Help us get them to the outpost, and you'll get your meeting with the captain." They fashioned crude stretchers for the wounded soldiers and set off toward the outpost. By sunset, they had reached the gates, where they were met by a reception of armed guards and the post surgeon. As the wounded were taken to the infirmary, Lucas and Violet were escorted to Captain Caldwell's office. The captain was a tall, imposing figure with a neat mustache and piercing eyes that evaluated them thoroughly as they entered. "Sergeant Miller tells me you came to their aid during the ambush," he said without preamble. He also says you claim to have information about illegal weapons trafficking. I'm listening." Lucas and Violet took turns explaining everything they had discovered: the reopened silver mine serving as cover for stolen army rifles, the forced labor, Sheriff Patterson's involvement, and Frank Doyle's position as ringleader. Captain Caldwell listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When they finished, he walked to a map on the wall, studying it thoughtfully. "We've had reports of missing weapons shipments for months," he finally said. 3 wagon loads of new Springfield rifles disappeared between Denver and Fort Union. Headquarters suspected an inside job but couldn't prove anything. He turned back to face them. "If what you're telling me is true, this operation isn't just about stolen weapons. It's treason. Those rifles could be headed to renegade groups or even foreign interests." "It's true," Lucas assured him. "We saw the crates ourselves, military markings being prepared for shipment." The captain nodded decisively. "I'll need your help to plan this operation. You know the mine layout, the personnel involved. With your testimony and what we find there, we can bring these men to justice." "When do we move?" Lucas asked. "Tomorrow at dawn," Caldwell replied. "Tonight you'll rest. My men will prepare for the raid." They were provided with quarters and fresh clothing. A medic examined Lucas's wound, expressing surprise at the quality of Dr. Miller's treatment under such conditions. That night, Lucas and Violet sat together on the narrow cot in her assigned room, the reality of what tomorrow might bring hanging between them. "Are you ready for this?" Lucas asked softly. "Once it starts, there's no turning back." Violet nodded, her expression resolute. "I've been ready since the day I realized what was happening to my town. What about you? Tomorrow you'll face the man who killed your brother." Lucas considered the question carefully. "A week ago, I would have said I was ready to kill him on sight. Now—" He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Now I want justice more than vengeance. I want to see him stand trial for what he's done to Matthew, to the men in that mine, to everyone." Violet's eyes shone with unshed tears. "You've changed." "Because of you," Lucas admitted. "You made me remember there's more to life than hunting down one man, that there could be a future worth living for." She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "What kind of future do you imagine, Lucas Harding?" He smiled, pressing a kiss to her copper hair. "One with you in it, if you'll have me. Maybe not right away, we both have ghosts to lay to rest first. But someday." "Someday," Violet agreed, turning her face up to his. "I think I'd like that very much." Their kiss was a promise, tender and hopeful despite the danger that awaited them at dawn. Morning came too quickly, gray light filtering through the window as they prepared. Captain Caldwell had assembled 30 men, a force he deemed sufficient to overwhelm the guards at the mine without risking excessive casualties. Lucas and Violet rode with the captain at the head of the column, guiding them along the least visible approach to the mine. The soldiers moved with disciplined silence, their blue uniforms darkened with dust for camouflage. They reached the ridge overlooking the mine just as the sun crested the eastern mountains. From their vantage point, they could see activity already underway in the compound. Wagons were being loaded, suggesting another shipment was being prepared. "Just in time," Caldwell murmured, surveying the scene through his field glasses. "Gentlemen, remember your orders. We want prisoners when possible, especially the ringleaders. But do not hesitate to defend yourselves if fired upon." He turned to Lucas and Violet. "You two stay with me. I want you to identify the key players, but I don't want you in the line of fire." Lucas nodded, though he had no intention of letting Frank Doyle slip away if the opportunity to capture him arose. At Caldwell's signal, the soldiers deployed to their assigned positions, surrounding the mine compound on 3 sides. When they were in place, a bugler sounded the charge, and the cavalry descended upon the mine in a coordinated attack. The surprise was complete. Many of the guards surrendered immediately, while others fired a few desultory shots before dropping their weapons. Only at the warehouse did significant resistance form, with several men taking cover behind crates and returning fire steadily. From their position behind a low stone wall, Lucas spotted Edmund Clark emerging from the mine office, looking panicked. Beside him, Sheriff Patterson was already raising his hands in surrender as soldiers approached. "There's Clark," Lucas pointed out to Caldwell, "but I don't see Doyle." Violet touched his arm, directing his attention to the small building where they had seen prisoners held. "Look!" Frank Doyle was running from the building toward a saddled horse, dragging a cloth sack that presumably contained valuables or incriminating documents. Without thinking, Lucas vaulted over the wall and sprinted after him. "Lucas!" Violet called, but he was already committed. Doyle reached his horse and was mounting when Lucas tackled him from behind. They crashed to the ground together, the sack spilling open to reveal bundles of cash and documents. Doyle was quick, drawing a knife from his boot and slashing wildly at Lucas. The blade caught Lucas's already wounded arm, reopening the healing injury. Pain lanced through him, but he managed to knock the knife away and pin Doyle to the ground. "Matthew Harding," Lucas growled, his face inches from Doyle's. "Remember that name, the man you murdered in Pueblo." Recognition and then fear dawned in Doyle's eyes. "Harding, you're his brother." "I am, and you're going to face justice for what you did to him. For all of it." Doyle bucked and twisted, nearly breaking free. But before he could escape, the butt of a rifle came down hard on his temple, rendering him unconscious. Lucas looked up to see Violet standing over them, one of the fallen guard's rifles in her hands. Her expression was a mixture of concern and determination. "I told you we'd do this together," she said, extending her hand to help him up. By noon, the fighting had ended. The mine was secured, prisoners were being processed, and the cavalry surgeon was tending to the few wounded on both sides. Captain Caldwell personally supervised the inventory of recovered weapons and documents, building a case that would ensure maximum charges against the conspirators. Lucas watched as Frank Doyle, now conscious but securely bound, was loaded into a prison wagon along with Clark, Patterson, and other key members of the operation. The man who had haunted Lucas's dreams for months now looked small and defeated, his arrogance replaced by the sullen resignation of a criminal facing justice. "What happens now?" Violet asked, standing beside Lucas as the wagons prepared to depart. "They'll be taken to Denver for trial," Caldwell explained, joining them. "Federal charges: weapons theft, treason, forced labor, not to mention multiple murders if what you've told me about their operation is correct. And Fort Garland." Violet's concern for her adopted town was evident in her voice. "I've dispatched men to maintain order until a new sheriff can be appointed," Caldwell assured her. "The territorial governor has been informed of the situation. He'll send officials to help the town transition." Lucas turned to Violet, taking her hands in his. "Will you go back?" She considered the question. "Eventually, yes. It's my home, and the bakery is all I have. People there will need normalcy after all this." She searched his face anxiously. "Will you come with me?" Before Lucas could answer, Captain Caldwell cleared his throat. "Actually, I have a proposition for both of you. The governor will need someone familiar with Fort Garland to help restore order, someone the people trust." He looked meaningfully at Violet. "And he'll need someone with experience handling difficult situations." His gaze shifted to Lucas. "Someone who understands justice but isn't blinded by it." "Are you offering us jobs, Captain?" Lucas asked, surprised. "Provisional appointments to start." If things go well, they could become permanent. Caldwell smiled slightly. The West needs good people who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right. You two have proven yourselves to be exactly that. Lucas looked at Violet, seeing his own hope and uncertainty reflected in her eyes. "What do you think?" "I think," she said slowly, "that we make a good team, and that Fort Garland deserves a chance to become the town it should have been all along." Lucas nodded, his decision made. "We accept, Captain. On one condition, we both want to testify at the trials. I need to see justice done for my brother, and Violet deserves to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves." "Agreed," Caldwell said, extending his hand. "The governor will be pleased." As the captain walked away to oversee final preparations, Lucas and Violet found themselves alone amid the controlled chaos of the operation's conclusion. "Are you sure about this?" Lucas asked softly. "Rebuilding a town won't be easy." Violet smiled, the expression lighting her face with a beauty that took his breath away. "Nothing worthwhile ever is. Besides, I have a feeling we've only just begun our adventure together." Lucas pulled her into his arms, no longer caring who might see. "I came to Fort Garland looking for an ending. Instead, I found a beginning. With the woman who sells bread at dawn," Violet added with a teasing smile. "The bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known," Lucas corrected, lowering his lips to hers. Their kiss sealed a promise of what was to come, not an easy road, perhaps, but one they would travel together. 3 months later, Fort Garland was transformed. The trials in Denver had concluded with convictions for all the major conspirators. Frank Doyle had received a life sentence for his role in the weapons operation and for Matthew Harding's murder. Sheriff Patterson, Edmund Clark, and their associates faced similar fates. The silver mine had been legitimately reopened under new management, providing honest employment for the town's residents. The forced laborers had been freed, with most choosing to remain in the area where they had found support and community. Lucas stood on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, his office now, the silver star on his chest still feeling somewhat foreign after years of answering to no one. Across the street, lights glowed in the bakery windows despite the early hour. Violet was already at work, the aroma of fresh bread drawing early customers just as it had drawn him that first morning. Their relationship had deepened over the months of working together to rebuild Fort Garland. Violet's strength and compassion had earned her the respect of everyone in town, while Lucas had proven himself to be a fair and capable lawman. As he watched, the bakery door opened and Violet emerged, carrying a covered basket. She spotted him and smiled, crossing the street with purposeful strides. "Good morning, Sheriff," she greeted him, her green eyes sparkling with the private joke they shared. In public, they maintained professional decorum, though everyone in town knew of their courtship. "Miss Townsend," he replied, tipping his hat, "you're abroad early." "I brought breakfast," she said, lifting the basket, "and news from Denver." Lucas raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Governor's office sent this," Violet continued, extracting an official-looking letter from her pocket. "Your appointment as sheriff is now permanent, and I've been named to the town council." "That calls for celebration," Lucas said, guiding her inside the office where they could speak privately. Once the door closed behind them, he pulled her into his arms, kissing her thoroughly. "I'm proud of you, Violet. This town is lucky to have you." "And you," she replied, her hands resting on his chest. "Lucas, there's something else we need to discuss." Her serious tone made him pull back slightly to study her face. "What is it, Doctor?" "Miller asked if I'd consider selling the bakery to his niece. She's moving here from back east and has experience." Lucas frowned, confused. "But you love the bakery. It's your father's legacy." Violet nodded. I do love it, but I've been thinking about what my father would really want for me. He believed in making a difference in following your heart. She took a deep breath. And my heart is with you, wherever that leads us, understanding dawned. Violet, are you saying, I'm saying yes, she interrupted, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You haven't asked yet, but when you do, my answer is yes. Lucas felt his heart swell with emotion. Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew the small box he'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I was going to do this properly. Had it all planned for your birthday next week. Violet laughed, the sound like music to his ears. When have we ever done anything according to plan? Lucas knelt before her, opening the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small emerald that matched her eyes. Violet Townsend, I rode into Fort Garland looking for trouble but found something infinitely more precious instead. I found you your courage, your compassion, your remarkable spirit. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she whispered, tears now flowing freely. 1,000 times yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, Lucas Harding knew with absolute certainty that this was what his brother had wanted for him all along. Not vengeance, but a life filled with purpose and love. Matthew would have approved of Violet, of the woman who had saved Lucas in every way that mattered. Outside, Fort Garland was coming to life, the streets filling with people going about their daily business. The town had healed from its wounds, just as Lucas and Violet had healed from theirs. Together, they had built something neither of them had been looking for, but had found nonetheless a home, a purpose, and a love that had begun with a simple loaf of bread at dawn. 5 years later, Lucas stood on the porch of their home on the outskirts of Fort Garland, watching as Violet chased their 3-year-old son Matthew through the garden. The boy's laughter rang out, pure and joyful, as he evaded his mother's playful pursuit. Their daughter, Emma, just 6 months old, slept peacefully in Lucas's arms, her tiny hand curled around his finger. She had her mother's copper hair and already the determined set to her jaw that Lucas recognized all too well. Fort Garland had prospered in the years since the mine conspiracy had been uncovered. The railroad had indeed come through, bringing new settlers and businesses. Violet's position on the town council had evolved into a role as schoolteacher, her passion for education making her perfect for the job. Lucas had continued as sheriff, though he was considering passing the badge to his capable deputy soon. The Harding Ranch, started 2 years ago on land east of town, was thriving under their care, fulfilling the dream his brother had once held. Papa. Matthew called, racing toward him with arms outstretched. Save me from the tickle monster, Lucas grinned, shifting Emma carefully as he reached down to scoop up his son with his free arm. I've got you, partner. The tickle monster can't get you now. Violet approached, her cheeks flushed from the game and her eyes bright with happiness. At 30, she was more beautiful than ever to Lucas, motherhood and confidence adding a radiance that took his breath away. Betrayed by my own husband, she lamented dramatically, reaching up to tickle Matthew anyway, making him shriek with delight. Sorry, son, Lucas laughed. Seems even the sheriff can't stand against this particular outlaw. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across their land, Lucas felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey that had brought him here had been marked by loss and pain, but it had led to something he never could have imagined that day. He rode into Fort Garland seeking vengeance. Later that evening, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Lucas and Violet sat together on the porch swing, her head resting against his shoulder as they watched the stars emerge. I had a letter from Captain Caldwell today, Lucas mentioned. Frank Doyle died in prison last week. Violet looked up at him, searching his face. How do you feel about that? Lucas considered the question. At peace, I think. Matthew got justice, that's what matters. And you found something more, Violet said softly. Lucas smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I found everything. A purpose beyond vengeance. A home. A family. He turned to face her fully. I found you selling bread at dawn. And I found a cowboy who rode into town for trouble, she replied with a smile, but brought love instead. Their lips met in a kiss that still held the same promise and passion as their first. As the night deepened around them, Lucas Harding knew with absolute certainty that this moment, this woman, this life they had built together was worth every mile of the long and winding trail that had led him to Fort Garland that fateful dawn.